Someone once told me that working shifts would cut years off your life. I'm not sure if that's true or if there's any science to back it up, but I still believe it. It's hell if you've never worked a shift before. Every week, the schedule is altered. You're in when you're in, and you live your life accordingly. Perhaps a job with reasonable hours would be more manageable. Something from a restaurant or a store. Yes, it's still a bad deal. However, it is a functional shit deal. But what about warehouses and factories? That's another goddamn story entirely. I've done a lot of late shifts before. They're not enjoyable. When you spend most of your time sleeping during the day and working at night, you don't have much time for anything else. It messes with your circadian rhythm, and you'll just switch things up again in a week when they put you on days. I'm not sure how anyone is supposed to deal with it, but I'm guessing the guys doing the shifts don't see it as their p-bobulum. They p-bobulably assumed we'd figure it out and put as little thought into it as possible. Anyway, my point is that shift work stinks, which is one of the reasons I refuse to do it these days. When I was younger, perhaps. Sure. What the hell happened? I was desperate for money and couldn't afford to be picky. Temp agencies are used by all of the warehouses and factories in my area. Any job you got wasn't guaranteed to be yours the next day. They only brought you in when they needed you, which meant you'd have a consistent job right up until the 3-month hiring deadline. Then you'd have a week or two where you weren't needed. Then it's back to it. Rinse and repeat, assuming you didn't start the cycle with someone else right away. But there was always the possibility of being hired on. Maybe if you worked hard enough, if you demonstrated that you were committed and willing to take the shit jobs no one else wanted, they'd see you as someone worth their time. Nowadays, I'm wiser. Temp agencies, factories, and warehouses are all filled with garbage. Sure, there could be some legitimately good ones out there. But I'm willing to bet those are uncommon. Most of them in my town are happy to keep as many people as possible on the temp worker treadmill. But now I'm beginning to ramble. My original point was that I no longer care about impressing these jerks. I only care about my paycheck. That's why I now only work during the day. When my temp agency calls about a night shift, or my current PL Danman attempts to PL Dan me on one, I always say no. If they ask me why, I will always lie. Usually, saying I have to watch my kids is sufficient. I don't have any children, but they have no idea. Little white lies like that, in my opinion, are a lot better than explaining to them why I'll never work another night shift in my life. It's more than just the fact that the hours are terrible and that you'll die slowly. It is much more than that. I don't go out at night at all. Since that night at Jefferson's, I haven't done so in about 5 or 6 years. That was my last night shift ever. It was February, which is usually a shit show in my part of the world. Winter in my area is relatively mild from November to mid-January. But, come February, all bets are off. That is when blizzards strike, and they always strike hard. I've had to dig my car out of the goddamn snow to get to work before, and I've had to trudge through snow drifts almost knee-deep just to walk through the parking lot of whatever warehouse I was stuck at for the day. It's not enjoyable. Anyway, it was February, and the forecast called for a blizzard that night. Freezing rain, sleet, and the whole 9 yards. It sounded bad, and when I got the call about a late night shift opening at Jefferson's, I was understandably hesitant to go out in what was shaping up to be the worst storm of the year. Having said that, I still had bills to pay. I needed the money. So, whether I liked it or not, I agreed to work the midnight shift at Jefferson's. To be fair to the establishment, Jefferson's wasn't all that bad. It was a little more relaxed than some of the previous warehouses I'd worked in, and I had some friends there. Dan, one of my friends, was working there at the time. Dan was a nice guy. Dan was probably one of the nicest guys I ever met. I'd known him since I was a kid, and even though he wasn't much older than me, I guess I still looked up to him a little. Like an older sibling or something. He was the one who was there for me after my father died. He was the type of guy who couldn't stand seeing people in pain, and if he saw someone in distress, he'd do everything in his power to make it better. That was something I always admired about him. He'd encourage me to hang out with him and his brothers, and he'd planned stuff for us to do on the weekends. He'd even invited me to join him and his brothers on fishing trips, along with a couple of other kids he thought needed a fishing trip. Dan believed that going fishing would solve most problems. You, the water, and a cold beer are all you need. I couldn't argue with his reasoning. I wasn't sure if he'd be working the midnight shift as well, but to be honest, I was hoping he would. I would have preferred to see a friendly Dan. I slept for about 5 or 6 hours before getting up to drive myself to Jefferson's. I left around 10 a.m. to arrive at 11 a.m. The drive shouldn't have taken an hour, but the snow was getting worse. I didn't want to be late, despite the bad weather. I recall the drive and not being as difficult as I had anticipated. I still took my time and arrived early enough to eat at the Tyler's drive-thru. I arrived about 10 minutes before my shift was scheduled to begin. There were a few other guys there already, maybe 10 or so, hanging out by the lockers and donning their yellow vests. Some of them were well known. I'd previously worked with them, though we weren't exactly friends. I exchanged a nod with Sam, a coworker I'd met a few times before. He was a little older and scrawny, but he worked hard. Despite his gray hairs, he had more stamina than a man his age should have. He was talking to a young man named Johnny who I didn't know, and I watched as the two exited the locker room together. I noticed another familiar Dan coming in through the door around the same time they did. The one man I'd hoped to see. Dan's eyes immediately lit up when he saw me. As he approached to clap me on the shoulder, he burst out laughing. He hit me hard enough to make my bones tremble, even though I knew he wasn't serious. The only negative thing I could say about Dan was that he didn't always recognize his own strength. Mitch. Man, it's been a long time. How are you? Can't really complain, man. They drew you in too, didn't they? Dan shook his head. You've got to pay the bills somehow, you know? He went to one of the lockers, leaving his phone and wallet inside. He then grabbed a safety vest and made his way out onto the floor. I walked alongside him, shooting the shit as we went. The majority of the other guys had already gathered, waiting for the supervisor to issue our marching orders. That night, I recognized the supervisor on duty. Bobby Alden is the name of the individual. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like every warehouse supervisor is named Bobby, and they're all the same scrawny little fuck with a pocket protector on a power trip. The type of guy who brews craft beer in his basement and brings it to every social gathering, almost as if he knows it tastes like carbonated piss and takes sadistic pleasure in watching you drink it just to be nice. Bobby Alden, on the other hand, was that type of Bobby. The only thing that distinguished him was that he always seemed to have a cough. He couldn't finish a sentence without coughing or clearing his throat in the most obnoxious way possible. Herk, herk, herk. It sounded like a coughing fit. It's most likely a shallow reason to dislike a guy. But it really got on my nerves. He was shooting the shit with some of the guys when Dan and I arrived, and once he realized everyone was present, he began assigning everyone off. Alrighty. Guys, we've got a busy night ahead of us, so let's get started. You too. He motioned to a small group of 4 guys huddled together. I'll have you pack and wrap the skids. Herk, herk, herk. And you guys. He motioned to myself, Dan, Johnny, and Sam, as well as another person. We have some trucks that need to be unloaded. Tommy, you have the forklift. The remaining man, whose name was apparently Tommy, simply nodded and went to work. Bobby stayed with the packing team to supervise them, while I, Dan, and the rest of the offloading team went down to the loading bay to do our work. Warehouse work is as dull as shit, and once we got started, I couldn't say it was particularly interesting. Unloading a truck, at the very least, expedites the day. I'm guessing we spent about 3 hours going through the first truck. The majority of what was inside appeared to be soap or mouthwash. I didn't look at it very closely. We were nearing the end of the truck when Dan sat down to rest on a pile of skids. I recall him saying, "Do you hear that wind, man?" I was aware of it. The metallic thudding sound of the snowstorm's howling winds crashing against the building. The noise was louder inside the truck, but you could hear it echoing off the walls whenever it wasn't drowned out by Tommy's forklift. "You're insane, man," Dan muttered. "I'm wondering how bad it is out there right now," Sam said as he stepped out of the truck. "Do you think we'd get hell if we looked?" Dan simply shrugged. "What the fuck are they going to do?" He stood up and checked to make sure Bobby wasn't watching us before walking over to one of the empty loading doors and flipping the switch to open it. The door slowly rolled open, revealing a swirling mass of white on the other side. We should have been able to see the streetlights from the road, as well as some of the nearby factories, from there. But we couldn't even see the truck we were unloading through the snow. Dan let out an awe-inspiring whistle as we stared into the storm. "Fuck me. Vape," he said. "We're probably going to sleep here. Has anyone brought a blanket?" I laughed, though a part of me wondered if it would still be this bad when my shift ended. Even if it wasn't, my car was almost certainly going to be buried. "That is insane," Johnny said before he trailed off. Dan went to close the door, only to be stopped by Johnny's voice. "Wait. Is that someone out there? Is there anyone out there? In this case?" Dan furrowed his brow. He looked out into the storm, only to have his eyes widen slightly when he saw what Johnny saw. "Holy shit. Yes, there is." It took me a moment to notice it, but once I did, it was difficult to miss him. I could make out the outline of a man walking through our parking lot. "What is he doing out there? He's got to be freezing," Sam exclaimed. "I don't think he's one of us. Perhaps a vagrant or something?" I speculated. Dan appeared to be frowning slightly. I'm sure he was thinking the same thing I was. Who else would be out late at night in this part of town, wandering around in a snowstorm? Given Dan's nature, I suppose what he did next was the only thing Dan could have done. To be honest, it's probably what any reasonable person would have done. I'm not sure. On paper, it's easy to say that we should have just shut the door and left the guy in the snowstorm alone. But Dan was not like that. He couldn't just leave things alone. He had to pitch in. Hey, come over here," he said, cupping his hands to his mouth. Come on over here." Of course, none of us questioned what he was doing. I knew Dan was only trying to help. Perhaps Sam and Johnny did as well, and when Dan began calling out to the stranger in the snow, they did as well. "Hey! Come on, people! Come over here." The man in the snow came to a halt and turned to Dan us. I doubt he could see us through the snow, but I'm sure he heard us. "Hold on. Look over here." The figure began to approach the door slowly, shuffling towards us. Bobby came up to investigate what was going on out of the corner of my eye. "There's a guy out there somewhere." Before he could even ask, I said, "There's someone out in the storm." Bobby simply pushed past me to check it out for himself. Then he turned to Dan and me. "Could you please get some coffee from the break room? Something spicy. That guy has got to be freezing his ass," he exclaimed. I didn't need to be reminded twice. I gave the stranger one last look before turning and jogging down to the break room. I used one of those pre-packaged instant coffee cups to get the guy something. I stepped out of the machine and looked back towards the loading dock to see how things were going. I was expecting to see Dan and the others assisting a man inside. Instead, I saw Sam and Johnny running frantically away from the door as Bobby and Dan attempted to close it. Jesus the Christ! I heard someone yell, and it took me a moment to realize what they'd already seen. Something crawled under the door as it began to close. I was too far away to see it clearly. All I can say is that it was shaped like a man, but it moved differently than any man I've ever seen. I watched as that thing crawled along the floor like an animal, moving at almost blinding speed, as soon as it got inside. It first looked over at Sam and Johnny before Bobby threw a box at it in an attempt to hurt it. Dan tried to grab it from the side, but whatever it was shrugged him off as if he didn't exist. He was attempting to restrain it 1 minute. He was on the ground the next thing I knew, and I could hear his screams. I stood there watching Bobby try to get that thing off of him. I could see some of the packing team members sprinting to assist. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I just stood there. Dan was terrified as whatever the hell that thing was ripped into him. When Bobby tried to hit it to get it to stop, it grabbed him and slammed him against the wall so hard that he left a smear of blood behind. I could hear his bones crunching all the way over by the break room. I watched as the packing crew recoiled at the sight of whatever it was and took off in the opposite direction. The man who'd emerged from the snow pursued them on all fours, letting out an inhuman shriek that echoed off the warehouse walls and made my entire body shake. I ran back into the break room, locked the door, and crouched behind it, praying to God that that fucking thing wouldn't find me. No prayers I could have said could have drowned out the screams. No. Nothing, in my opinion, could have drowned those out. I could hear a forklift moving somewhere in the warehouse, followed by a loud crash. I could hear men's terrified screams in their final moments. It felt like it went on for hours. However, it couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. I could hear distant screams after the forklift crashed. I could hear bodies being thrown around, and then nothing. Only a pregnant silence descended. I remained where I was, my back against the break room door, as if I could keep whatever was outside from coming in. I knew there was no way I could have kept it out after seeing how easily it had picked up and killed Bobby. I was just hoping it wouldn't find me or sniff me out. Steps could be heard echoing throughout the warehouse. As whatever had killed everyone else patrolled the area, I could hear inhuman chirps and sounds. The lights eventually went out. Because they were activated by motion, there was no need to keep them on if a section of the warehouse was empty. When they were gone, I decided to sneak a peek out the window to see if that thing had gone. Lights were turned on at the far end of the warehouse, nowhere near the loading bay. It was still present. I saw it rummaging through a skid, tearing open boxes to see what was inside. I could see the blood on its hands even from a distance. The forklift was partially buried beneath some collapsed boxes, with Tommy still in the driver's seat. I could see a blood trail leading into a row of packed skids. And I knew I didn't want to see what happened at the end. Everyone had died. Everyone except me. I ducked back under the door, curled into a fetal position like a child. When the lights outside came back on, I tensed up again, covering my mouth so I didn't scream or make a sound. I could hear the man's shuffling footsteps from the snowstorm nearby, but I couldn't tell how close they were. I listened as they became louder and louder, and then faded. He was leaving. I remained motionless. I remained silent. The shuffling footsteps became a whisper as they got further away, drowned out by the howling wind. I'd never been more terrified in my life. When the lights went out again, I crept across the floor to the bathroom and shut the door as quietly as I could. I locked it and turned off the lights. I didn't get up until the morning. When the next shift came in, I nearly punched the guy who tried to open the door. It took a couple of guys to keep me from thrashing and screaming until I realized I was safe. Everything that followed is a blur. The police interrogations, the suspect lineup. In my memory, everything is hazy. Everything blends together like a dream. Dan, Bobby, Johnny, Sam, Tommy, and the rest of the gang. They were all gone. Each and every one of them. Something had entered and simply killed them. On my way out, I noticed some of the bodies. Most of them had been hidden, but I'm pretty sure they hadn't reached Johnny yet. It used to be Johnny, I believe. I didn't have much time left to get a positive ID on the body. Whoever it was has been haunting my dreams ever since. After the incident at Jefferson's, I took a few months off work. I spoke with a therapist. I spent some time at the bottom of a bottle before finally getting my SHT together. I tried looking for work outside of temp agencies but was unable to find anything suitable. I don't have the credentials to work in most other PL dons, and I don't have the time or money to get them. So I went back to the temp agencies. That's all there is to it. I'm used to it. Dan would have probably found a silver lining in all of this. That was his personality. But, sadly, I am not Dan. God knows I miss him every day. I sometimes wonder if I made the right decision by hiding like a chicken shit when that thing became violent. Maybe someone else would have died if I hadn't rushed in and tried to help Bobby pull it off of him. Or perhaps it would have killed me just as easily as it killed everyone else, and Dan would have preferred that I live. I'm not sure. I cannot speak on behalf of the deceased. In the end, I don't think it really matters whether or not I survive. They never found the man who was responsible for what happened that night. Of course, this is assuming that it was a man. I'm not sure if a human is capable of doing that to other people, but what do I know? All of the questions from the cops and all of the digging they did didn't turn up anything. The stranger from the snowstorm vanished into the night, and he never returned, as far as I know. Even if I wanted vengeance or closure, I wouldn't know where to begin. I simply no longer work nights and do not go out after dark. It's unlikely that I'll ever see that man again, but if I do, well, I'd rather not take any chances.